Imagine for a second that you're building something massive. Maybe you're a CEO, launching a startup, or maybe a grassroots movement.
Or just planning a family reunion.
Right. Even that, you have this vision, and naturally you're worried about what or who is going to ruin it.
It's that standard leadership anxiety. You're always looking for the threat.
Exactly. And the standard playbook says you look outward. You look at your competitors, you look at government regulators, you look at the people throwing rocks at your front door.
Which makes total sense. Those are the tangible enemies.
But today, we're doing a deep dive into a source that says if you are looking out the window, you are making a fatal mistake. The thing that is most likely to destroy your vision. It isn't the enemy at the gate.
It's sitting right next to you at the conference table.
It's the internal enemy. And we're going to explore this through a really fascinating philosophical lens.
We're diving into a lecture from the YouTube channel Kenosis. This is lecture 114 from their Bible Humanities series.
And that name, kenosis, it's worth flagging right at the top. It's not just a random word.
No, it really sets the tone. Kenosis is Greek for self-emptying. It's a term used to describe, Jesus emptying himself of divine status to become human. So you know right away this isn't about gaining power.
It's about stripping things away. And today we're stripping away the layers on the Apostle Paul, the book of Galatians, and this really dangerous tension between doctrine, the rules, and essence, the actual point of it all.
And the mission here really is to understand how the structures we build, religious rules, corporate policies, how they can end up suffocating the very thing they were meant to protect.
So let's jump in. The source starts with a figure most of us know, the Apostle Paul. But he's not framed as some stained glass saint. He's a guy with an impossible strategy.
Paul's world mission, yeah. You have to remember, this is the first century. Travel is brutal. There's no internet. And Paul has this almost insane vision to take this tiny Jewish sect and evangelize the entire Roman Empire.
Talk about a scaling problem.
It's a huge ambition. And of course, a lot of people hated him for it. I mean, really hated him.
The source mentions that detail about people vowing not to eat or drink until he was dead.
That's a very committed diet plan.
It's serious dedication. So you've got assassins fasting, you have the Roman Empire. You'd think that is the main threat.
But the source argues the complete opposite. The external enemies, the persecution, it was like wind to a fire. It actually strengthened their resolve.
It creates that us against the world bond.
Precisely. The real call was coming from inside the house. The thing that almost broke Paul, that almost stopped Christianity in its tracks, was the Jewish Christians inside the church.
Okay, explain that. Because from the outside, they all sound like they're on the same team.
They believed in the new faith, but they were deeply attached to the old ways. They basically said, okay, we'll accept this new thing, but you still have to follow all the old Jewish laws. Circumcision, diet, the works.
They're trying to drag the old furniture into the new house.
And that internal friction was grinding the whole movement to a halt. Which brings us to where these rules, these doctrines even come from.
Right. I think most of us assume they're handed down from on high.
Yeah.
A cloud parts, a voice booms.
The movie version. But the source says doctrine is almost always a product of the times. It's reactive, it's defensive.
And the example of the Trinity it was mind-blowing. I just assumed it was foundational.
Well, the source argues it was basically a PR solution. Imagine the early Christians out in the Greek and Roman world. They're preaching one God. But then they talk about the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit.
And the Greeks, being very logical, start counting on their fingers.
Exactly. They go, wait a minute, 1 + 1 + 1, that's 3. You say you're monotheist, but you worship 3 gods, you're frauds.
Which completely undermines their credibility.
It was a crisis. So the church spent hundreds of years arguing and debating to come up with the language of the Trinity. 3 persons, 1 God, specifically to answer that question from the outside.
So doctrine is a shield. It's built to deflect a specific attack.
Yes. And the point isn't that it's false. The point is that the formulation was a human construct for a specific historical problem. But then we forget that.
We start treating the shield like it's the thing we're supposed to be protecting.
And that is the trap. Which brings us to this brilliant analogy the speaker uses, the bowl and the water.
I love this. It's so simple and clear. Break it down for us.
Okay. The water is the essence. It's God, truth, life itself. You need it to survive. It's non-negotiable.
Simple enough.
But you can't just carry water in your hands. It spills, it gets dirty. You need a container, a bowl. The bowl is the doctrine, the rituals, the church structure.
So the bowl is necessary. We're not saying get rid of all bowls.
No, we need the bowl. But the bowl changes. Once it was a gourd, then a brass chalice. Now maybe it's a paper cup. The container adapts to the culture.
But the water, the H2O, is always the same.
The water is eternal. But dogma faith, as the source calls it, is when people fall in love with the antique brass bowl. They polish it, they write books about it, they worship it, and if someone shows up with a simple glass cup,
They scream, heresy, you can't drink from that.
even if they themselves are dying of thirst because they're too busy admiring the bowl to actually drink from it, and the lecturer gives some really sharp modern examples of this.
The Sabbath elevator. I had never heard of this.
It's a perfect case study. In strict Jewish law, you can't work on the Sabbath. And modern rabbis decided that pressing an elevator button, completing a circuit, counts as work.
Okay, but if you live on the 30th floor of a high-rise in Tel Aviv, taking the stairs is not exactly restful.
Exactly. The water, the whole point of the Sabbath is rest. But the bowl, the rule, creates a problem. So they invented a workaround, the Shabbat elevator.
And this is a real thing.
Oh, very real.
Ah.
The elevator is programmed to automatically stop on every single floor. It goes up one floor, the doors open, they wait, they close, then the next floor.
So your 1-minute ride turns into a 20-minute ordeal.
It takes forever. And you just stand there. Maybe you're elderly, you're frustrated, you're exhausted by the machine that's supposed to help you rest.
You've technically followed the rule, but you have completely violated the spirit of it.
You've kept the bowl pristine, but you've spilled all the water. It's form over function to a tragic degree.
And speaking of things that get complicated, the source then pivots to money, tithing.
The classic 10%.
For a lot of people, I think it feels like a transaction. You write the check, you pay your God insurance, and you hope nothing bad happens to you.
That's what the source calls arithmetic tithing. It's transactional, as if God is the IRS.
But the argument is that this is just another empty bowl.
Right. The lecture goes back to the original meaning of tithing. It wasn't about funding a building. It was a social safety net. Eating the tithe meant using those resources to feed the orphans, the widows, the immigrants.
It was basically Social Security.
It was a system of radical community care. The source says if you're meticulously calculating 10% for an institution, but you ignore your neighbor who can't pay their medical bills, you've missed the entire point.
You're staring at the formula and missing the human being right in front of you.
Which is a perfect lead-in to this other metaphor he uses, one from Buddhism.
The finger pointing at the moon.
It's such a universal image. The moon is the ultimate reality, the truth, God.
And the finger.
The finger is the scripture, the teacher, the doctrine. The finger is essential. It shows you where to look.
But the problem is, we tend to stare at the finger.
We do. We obsess over the finger. We argue about the knuckle. We analyze the fingernail. We build entire institutions to study the finger. And we never actually look up at the moon.
The source calls this finger worship.
And he connects it to a math analogy I found really helpful. He compares a dogmatic believer to a student who just memorizes a formula, like a squared plus b squared equals c squared.
They can pass the test if the question is exactly what they studied.
Right. But they don't understand the why. They don't get the logic behind it. So if you give them a new problem that requires applying the principle in a slightly different way,
They freeze. They say, but that's not the formula we learned.
whereas a true mathematician understands the principle, they can derive a new formula if needed. They have the water, so they can always make a new bowl.
And this shift from rule following to really understanding seems to be what triggered a personal change for the speaker himself. He gets pretty vulnerable here.
This was the emotional heart of the lecture for me. He admits he used to see God as a king on a throne, based on that imagery from the book of Revelation. Very distant, very powerful, very intimidating.
The God of dogma.
Totally. But then he has this epiphany. He starts to see God not as a king, but as a Habiru.
You have to define that term for us.
It's an ancient word. It refers to the lowest class of laborers, the wanderers, the dust-covered workers who did the hard, manual, dirty jobs.
So he goes from an image of a king in silk robes to a worker in dusty overalls.
It's a radical shift, and he starts seeing the world differently. He talks about cherry blossoms, not as just products of photosynthesis, but as God working overtime, handcrafting each petal, mixing each scent.
Just to comfort a human being.
And the sea pebbles. That one really got me. He describes the waves crashing against jagged rocks for millions of years. He sees it not as erosion, but as God's labor.
Labor for what?
grinding the sharp rocks into soft sand, just so his children have a safe place to play. It's the image of a parent clearing a field of thorns.
That changes everything. You don't obey a God like that out of fear. You respond out of just overwhelming gratitude.
It moves faith from a transaction to a relationship. You realize the water has been keeping you alive all along, even while you were fighting over the bowl.
So to bring this all home, the deep dive ends back with the Apostle Paul, fighting that internal enemy. The source points to a passage in Galatians that sounds really harsh.
It's very intense. Galatians chapter 1, Paul says, "If anyone, even an angel from heaven, preaches a different gospel to you, let them be under a curse."
Let them be accursed. To a modern ear, that sounds like the ultimate intolerance. It sounds like dogma.
It really does, but you have to look at who he's cursing. He's not cursing the Romans or the atheists.
He's cursing the insiders.
He's cursing the people trying to bring back the bull. The different gospel wasn't some new idea about Jesus. It was the insiders saying, you must be circumcised. You must follow the old laws.
So he's cursing the rule makers.
He is cursing enslavement. He sees that if you start adding all these conditions back onto faith, if you tell people they need the antique brass bowl, you are killing the very freedom the movement was about.
So the curse is a do not enter sign on the road back to slavery.
That's a perfect way to put it. This lecture frames Galatians as Christianity's declaration of independence from the tyranny of religious forms.
It's a powerful warning, and it really forces you to look at your own life, your own systems, the way you run your company or your family or your own beliefs.
We all have our bowls, and the question is, am I protecting the water? Or am I just polishing a bowl that doesn't even hold water anymore?
We spend so much energy defending the way we've always done things.
And sometimes that's the very thing stopping anyone from getting a drink.
The source ends by bringing up Nietzsche. God is dead.
The ultimate slogan of atheism, right?
Usually. But the speaker asks, when critics say God is dead, are they actually rejecting the divine, the water? Or are they just looking at our dusty, cracked antique bowl and saying, that thing is useless?
Maybe the God that's dead is just the dogma.
And maybe that idol of our rules and structures. Maybe it needs to die so we can find a living reality again.
Sometimes you have to smash the bowl to remember what water feels like.
It's a heavy thought to leave you with. Next time you find yourself defending a rule, just take a second. Ask yourself, am I pointing at the moon? Or am I just yelling at everyone to look at my finger?
Distinguish the finger from the moon. That's the challenge.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.
Take care.